The 21 Escapes of Lieutenant Alastair Cram, a compelling story of courage and endurance in the Second World War, by David M. Guss. Read by Joshua Manning. For Kate. Through the Wire and Home Together. I never hear the word escape without a quicker blood, a sudden expectation, a flying attitude. Emily Dickinson. Escape as a need, as a spiritual necessity. Alastair Cram. Preface. Finding Alastair Cram. I never met Alastair Cram, and if I had, I'm not sure he would have enjoyed being the subject of a book. He was such a private person, so reserved and modest, so relentlessly uninterested in talking about his many adventures. And yet he did leave a paper trail, beginning with a set of journals written immediately after the war. Even these were nearly impenetrable. Written in pencil, with little punctuation and words often running into one another, they were the work of a man possessed with the need to get it all down. He toyed with the idea of publishing it, wondering if it might not serve as a manual for escape. This book, he wrote in one entry, is a record of one individual's ventures outside the wire, its excuse being to represent as faithfully as possible the background of escape in Europe in this war, for the adventures related here were typical of those experienced by many hundreds of officers and men of the United Nations. Of course, Alastair's experiences were anything but typical, nor did he ever try to publish it. He simply took the foolscap and cheap school notebooks he'd written on and stuffed them into an envelope, never to be looked at by him again. When I discovered them 60 years later, there were pages missing, some torn and others misfiled. Almost all of them were nearly illegible, and even with the help of an amateur cryptographer from Texas, took several years to decipher. I knew long before then, if not immediately, that his was a story I had to tell. I had known of Alastair since childhood, a legendary figure haunting the escape literature I began devouring in large quantities from the age of 12. It's what turned me into a reader and lover of books, and eventually into a researcher as well. Such works were readily available to British children of a similar age, but I lived in America, where only a handful of the most famous titles like The Great Escape and The Wooden Horse were to be found. A mathematics teacher with the improbable nickname of Butts came to my rescue. He had been ordering rare Lewis Carroll books from England for years and offered to add my list to his own. Today, when almost anything can be purchased over the internet with the promise of next-day delivery, it's hard to remember that incomparable joy in receiving a long-anticipated package which had traveled by ship across the Atlantic. It wasn't long before I began writing to the authors, peppering them with questions and advice about other titles. None was more generous than Pat Reed, who had described his own hair-raising escape in The Colded Story. Having grown up reading escape literature from the previous war, Reed understood my fascination and responded with long, sensitive letters, often accompanied by a book or photograph. Then I went to college, and the Vietnam War took over, cooling my interest in anything related to the military. I wrote poetry, studied art, lived with an indigenous group in the headwaters of the Orinoco, published books on South American mythology, and eventually became an anthropologist. Busy with teaching and research, it was years before I thought seriously about escape again. But on a visit to the local public library one day, I wandered over to 940.54, the Dewey Decimal System's classification for the Second World War and escape. To my surprise, there were a number of new titles I'd never seen before. Unlike the first generation of books written immediately after the war, these were by men who had recently retired, or simply wanted their stories recorded before they died. I pulled Tommy Cownan's Free as a Running Fox off the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?